Hello and welcome back to the Microsoft Excel Collegiate Challenges training series, Making Sense of Excel. In this series, we're covering a number of personal finance topics while also introducing you to many Excel functions, techniques, and modeling skills. In this video, we're going to be talking about budget analysis. Analyzing your budget is a really crucial part of understanding what you're spending so you can make wise and informed financial decisions. So in this video, we're going to show you the basic functions you can use to analyze a budget and some other advanced techniques you can use to better dig into what it is you're spending. Let's get to it. All right, in this challenge, we have a number of instructions at the beginning. I'm going to run through these as we go. Notice that we're only going to have a few parameters this time. These are going to drive a few of the questions 6 and 11, to make those answers dynamic. That way, when the parameters change, those answers are going to change. However, most of the answers aren't going to change in this challenge. We're going to have a set, kind of fixed data set we're going to use that I'll show you in a second, meaning that many of these answers will stay the same, except for those on question 6 and question 11. All right, so the first thing we want to do is understand what kind of data we're working with. So if we go to our budget data tab, what we're going to see is spending data. We see first that we have a list of vendors and a category of each type of spending. For example, the power company, XLOOKUP Waste Management, and Filter Water Company all are utilities. All right, we'll see a number of different titles throughout the businesses, most tied to Excel. We also have then spending data. So presumably this is what you or someone you're helping with their budget has spent over the first 3 months of this year. So we see a spending date, the vendor, and the amount you've spent. Now we're going to do some really big setup right now that's going to make the rest of our model quite a bit easier, and it's going to mean that we're not going to have to always be tabbing back and forth between our question tab and this data tab. So what I'm going to do is actually name a couple ranges. All right, so what I'm going to do is select this entire column, and I'm going to come up here to the top. Notice it says E3, so that is the top cell here, but if I click in here, I can type the word dates. And what that's done now is name this entire range, or given this a named range of dates. So if I come over here and type dates now, you'll see it gives me all the dates. In this case, it's giving me the number without the formatting, but it is giving me those values. Now I can do the same thing for vendors. Now I'm going to hit Alt F3 to get over there. I'm going to call this vendors. And then same for the amounts, and we'll do Alt F3 and type in amounts. So now I've done a little bit of prep work to make the next few questions easier, and we'll see how that works. So we can look at our first question and say how many expenses are in the data. So the count function will tell us how many of entries show up, so we can do count of amounts. So we see very quickly we have 171, and we didn't have to tab back over to our budget data to figure that out. Similarly, if we want to figure out how many expenses occur in March, well, it'd be helpful to have a column that tells us exactly which month we're in. So we're going to actually go over and prep our data here. So let's create a new column. We're going to call it month. And here we can just use the month function to figure out the month for each number. And if I go down, I can copy that down with Control D. So now I'm going to name this again. In this case, I'm going to name it months. So now we can work with that on our challenge tab here. And we can say how many expenses occurred in March. Well, now we can use a COUNTIF. So what COUNTIF is going to do is going to count a range again. So in this case, our range of months, and we have to give it a criteria. So we want March, and in that case, March corresponds to the number 3. So if we put COUNTIF months, 3, it tells us there are 54 occurrences of March in there. So that's a quick way to use COUNTIF to determine how many times a certain thing occurs in data. So now we want to know how much money was spent in March. So now, instead of counting how many times March shows up or how many amounts are in March, we want to sum up the amounts that correspond to March. So if we go and look at our data, what that would mean is as we scroll down, we can see everything here in March, and we want to add up all these numbers where there's a 3 next to it. All right, but we want to make this formula dynamic. That way it would work even if the month were 1 or 2, and to really add flexibility to our model, and we'll see where that comes in just a few questions. But let's practice that by doing SUMIFs. And again, I've set this up already, so we can just type amounts, and we want the months where the answer is 3, where it's March. And we very quickly get our answer there. We can double check that it's correct. All right, so we've got some basics down with count, COUNTIF, and SUMIFs. Now we're going to use them to look at multiple categories. So in this case, we're asking about what's the maximum number of expenses in one category. So the first thing we're going to do is let's get our category list. So let's just make a field here, and we're going to get our unique categories. So we have our categories all over here. We want to get a unique list of that. So we can always remove duplicates. That's an option in our data tab. That's kind of the old way to do it, is you can remove the duplicates. Alternatively, and kind of the more modern way, if you're in Excel 365, is to use the unique function. So we'll use the unique function on this array, and it only brings us back one occurrence of each of the things we wanted. The other thing we need to do is prep our data a little bit more and tie the category of each vendor over to our data. So let's do a quick XLOOKUP, where we're going to look up the vendor in our list of vendors, using F4 to lock all that, and return back that category. So if I copy that down, you can see we've got it working there. And now we want to actually, let's name that whole range again. So my keyboard stopped working for a second there. Sometimes Excel does some funky things. But we get it back, and we've got categories named now. All right, now the reason we did all that legwork is to make this function over here easy. So we want to know which has the maximum number of expenses. So we're going to have our counts, and we're going to do a COUNTIF again, just like we did before. And we're going to count our categories now. There's our value. And if they're equal to the category we have listed there. So in this case, there are 9 utilities expenses, but we want this to work for everything there. So you could copy this down, and that would work. Alternatively, we can just use our spilled array with the hashtag there by referencing that, and now it's going to automatically spill down for us, which is a really nice feature of these dynamic arrays, and we've introduced those in a little bit more detail in some of the other videos. All right, so now we see 63 is the maximum number. It shows up for restaurants. So if we want to get that in the formula, let's just use max on that array. Notice that the array, if we look at the formula, was C48 hashtag, right? So that allows it to all spill down. So that way, if you had new categories show up in your spending, the formulas would automatically update and would still work, which is really the beauty of using these dynamic arrays. So the next question is, which category is that? So we can obviously see 63 is associated with restaurants, but again, we want this to be dynamic if our data changes. So then we can do an XLOOKUP, where we're going to look up that 63 in our data and return back the category. Again, you can see the hashtags being used there. Another nice feature of that is that we don't have to lock those cells always. If we're going to copy the formula around, we do. But because the formula is automatically adapting to the size there because of the hashtag, that's another nice kind of feature there. All right, so our next question is, what is the total spending in the selected category? So selected category, in this case, is rent. So first we have to build some SUMIFs to get the totals by category, and then we'll look up the one that's in the rent category. So let's go ahead and get our totals first. And here we're using SUMIFs the same way we did before. We're using amounts. Our criteria is the categories. We have that now, and we just want to reference our category, again using the hashtag so this all spills down. So there we've got our totals, and now we can see that 1680 is the amount for rent. So let's do our XLOOKUP. What are we going to look up? Well, here we have our parameter value. Look it up in our category and get back our total. All right, kind of a standard XLOOKUP use there. But now we want to know which category has the highest spending across all months. So this is kind of similar to the question we had before, where we were doing the max of the counts, but now we're going to do it all in one step. So let's do an XLOOKUP here, where we put a max inside of it. So here it's the idea of nesting formulas inside one another. You can do this as much as you want. It can make it harder to tell what's going on in a formula. It's just going to look more intimidating. So often it's best modeling practice to break things out, particularly when other people are going to use them. But in some cases, it can be convenient to combine them this way. So we're going to do a max of that data. And where are we going to look that max up? Well, in exactly where we found the data, and then we're going to return back our category. So here we see that rent was the maximum category, which was also the category we were looking for. All right, the next one is going to add another layer to this. It says which category has the lowest spending in a single month. So if we recall, we have 3 months here, 1, 2, and 3. And so we want to know how much spending were in utilities in month 1, utilities month 2, month 3, and do the same for all the categories. Now, ideally, we can write one formula that we can drag across this whole area to do this quickly and efficiently for us. So that's what we're driving towards. One thing I'm going to do is improve my labeling real quick and note that these are months. And one thing you could do here is center across this selection to make it really nice. Or what a lot of people like to do actually is merge and center. Merge and center can be a pretty troublesome one because it makes it really hard to select entire columns and makes keyboarding less efficient. Instead, we can go into alignment and center across selection. So that's going to make it a lot nicer. We can still do our underline to just make this look visually appealing. All right, so now let's get to our formula. So here we're going to get SUMIFs. We're still going to sum our amounts, so we have that. Our criteria range, so it's still going to be categories. And here I'm not going to actually use the hashtag. Instead, I'm going to lock the column. So I hit F4 3 times. That way I'd lock the B. So that way when this drags to the right, it's not going to move this reference to column B. We're always going to be referencing utilities. Now this next criteria is actually the months, and we've set that up with a named range as well. And here I want to reference month 1, but I want this to move right, but not to move down. So we hit F2 twice, so it locks row 47, but it's going to allow the column to float. So once we've done that, we can copy this formula and paste it across this entire range. All right, so now why didn't I just use B48 hashtag and E47 hashtag? Well, doing the hashtag in 2 directions is not going to work for us. There are ways to make this work dynamically. You just have to use some more advanced functions that we're not going to go into today, but it definitely is possible. In this case, it's easiest just to add across, to copy the formula across and make sure we lock those references. So now we can do just a little bit more work to figure out the minimum for each category by month. And we can copy that down with Control D. And now we can do our same trick as before where we do an XLOOKUP of the minimum of whatever's in there. We're going to look it up there and give us back our category. So we should see that travel is the lowest category by month because in February we didn't travel at all. All right, so that was the lowest in February there. Let's see, what is the highest increase in spending from January to March? Well, that requires us to calculate some growth numbers. So let's take our March spending divided by our January spending. In this case, it says 100.4%. We really don't want that. We just want the growth piece. So let's subtract 1. And again, we can copy that down to see that we have our growth numbers. Now, which one's the highest? Well, here again, we can use max over all of our growth numbers, and we see that 47.3, which corresponds to our entertainment category. So if you're doing your own budget analysis, this would be where you could say, okay, well, what did I do different in January versus February and March? And maybe I want to get back more towards January, or maybe I got a raise, and so that's why it's okay to increase this spending. Whatever it is, it's important to be knowledgeable of what your spending is going to, because that's what allows you to make informed decisions. We're not going to judge any of these decisions. It's just about knowing. That way you can make the best decisions for you and for your situation. All right, we've got just a couple questions left. Let's just quickly validate our answers are right. They're looking good. So now we're going to say, let's exclude restaurants and say which store had our lowest average spending per transaction. So there's a lot going on here. First, average spending, we can use AVERAGEIFs. We'll get to that in a minute. We also have to do it by store. So let's get a list of our store or our vendors. So just like before, we had our list on the budget tab. I'm just going to come over here and reference all this to pull that in. So we've got our vendors, and then we're going to have our average cost. However, we want to exclude restaurants in this case. So we don't want anything in here that has the restaurant associated with it. All right, so there are a number of ways to do this. I want to show you the filter function because this is a really powerful function that I think you should all know. All right, so the way filter works is we're going to filter some array. So we give it an array. This is what we're interested in, basically our spending data by date. And I want to filter it based on this column over here. So I'm going to select the column I want to filter it on, and then I have to type in my criteria. So in this case, I want ones that are not restaurants. So for not equals to, we use the greater than less than together. And then we're going to say restaurants. And let's see if we got that right. Well, we see that we have the same amount of data as before, so something didn't work, and it's because I spelled restaurants wrong. So let's make sure we get that right. As soon as we get our spelling right, we can see that, for example, proper foods, the first restaurant list has been taken out when we get over here. So we've filtered our list down so we have a smaller set of data to work with that excludes the restaurants already. All right, so now that we have that, let's go calculate our average ifs. All right, so we're going to average if on some range. Notice here what we're going to average are the amounts over here. And I'm going to have to keep going back and forth here because I haven't named these ranges. So you can really see the value of the named ranges and that I haven't done it at this point. So we need the criteria range. Let's go back and get our criteria. It's going to be the vendor. So let's select that. And finally come over and select which vendor we're interested in. All right, so let's copy that. Let's go to the bottom and paste it. All right, we see we have some divide by zero errors. What's happening there? Well, Count Your Eggs is a restaurant. So because of that, it's trying to take a total that it doesn't find and divide by something at the count of 0, so it's a divide by 0 error. We would rather not show that. We'd rather that show as blank. So let's do an if error. So the way if error works is whatever is in the function, if that returns an error message like divide by 0, then instead give me something else. In this case, I just want blank quotes, so the cell looks empty. So if I copy that, now I've effectively removed those errors. Now why that's important is because if I want to figure out, the minimum from this list, say, right? So I want to do a minimum of this list. Well, that'll work, but only if there are no errors in it. As soon as the errors are in it, this next function would also give me an error. So I have to remove the errors before I can use other functions. And the question here, though, is not what is the minimum, but what is the store with the minimum. So let's do our same technique we have been using. And here we see Excel Flicks, your source for all Excel esports videos is the answer to this question. So we got that working, that answer is right, and we have one left to go. Now this last question is a dynamic one. It's not really related to everything else we've done so far, but it shows you how to dynamically use dates. In this case, we want to get total spending between the start date and the end date. So let's use SUMIFs one last time to get this one right. All right, let's make sure we can see everything, and we're going to do a SUMIFs. And what are we going to sum? Well, the amounts. So we already set that up for amounts, and now we want a criteria on the dates. We had set that up. And now we want dates that are greater than or equal to January 9th in this case. So to do this, we're going to use quotes, greater than or equal to, and then the ampersand key with our start date. Now there's a lot kind of behind how this is working. Essentially, you need a string variable in that third argument and in this fifth argument. And we create that by using the ampersand to connect the text that we have with our parameter value. This is a little bit of an advanced topic and one that's definitely tricky to master, but hopefully this gives you a little exposure and you can dig a little bit more deeply if this is something you want to use. The reason it's so powerful is that what it does is it now makes this formula dynamic. That way when the parameters change, you can see our answer is always changing as well, even though we haven't had to change the formula, and all that changed was our start date and end date, which can be particularly important when you're looking at budget analysis. Thank you again for joining me for this edition of Making Sense of Excel. I hope you're enjoying the Microsoft Excel Collegiate Challenge. Getting involved is the most important thing, building your skills, getting ready for both your career and for the real world.